Joining me today is Russell Smart, Chairman of the National Scouting Museum Task Force and a member of the Philmont Scout Ranch Committee here at Philmont Scout Ranch. And today we're going to take a look at the totality of World Jamborees and some of the materials that Scouts and Scouters may have brought back with them that was provided to them by the Jamboree. Russell, thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about these handbooks, guidebooks, diaries, as well as pins and patches. What exactly are we looking at here?
Well, in an earlier one, Harold, we talked about the first 5 World Scout Jamborees, but the World Scout Jamboree has continued, and so now we've had 24 that have happened, and we got the 25th one coming up next summer in 2023 in Korea. But in the meantime, there have been 24 that have occurred beginning in 1920, and then the most recent one before next year, 2019, that we hosted in conjunction with Mexico and Canada at the summit in West Virginia.
So tell me about some of these handbooks and guidebooks and things. What was their purpose and why do they have them?
Well, there's not always been materials issued. The first Jamboree, World Scout Jamboree in 1920, there were no patches. There were no souvenirs other than some paper items, some stamps, program books, things like that. But since then, there's been a lot, and of course it gets more and more with every event that we host. But even in 1920, at the first World Scout Jamboree, there was a handbook, and it's called Boy Scouts and Citizenship. And this book talked about what was going to happen at the Jamboree and some of the outcomes that Lord Baden-Powell hoped would happen because of that first World Scout Jamboree.
Because that first one was a social event, the second one was competitive, as we talked about before.
Right.
Was that guidebook any different from the second one?
It was certainly different. It was produced by the country that hosted it, Denmark, and so they approached it very differently than Britain did for that first one. But in essence, it was still about what's going to happen during the course of the Jamboree and what opportunities are there for Scouts who are participating in it. There were also advertisements because we had to find a way to fund all of these things, and local businesses in the countries that hosted the Jamboree participated by sponsoring ads in those handbooks and literature that was produced.
Now that Jamboree in Denmark was the first one that had a patch or a souvenir type item, but it has a unique number in the center of it. So how did that work?
Yes, sort of. It really wasn't intended to be a patch as we think about it today. They needed a way. There were going to be about 5,000 scouts and leaders in attendance at that World Scout Jamboree, as there had been at the first one. And so there was a need to have a way to monitor the meals that they were going to eat while they were at the Jamboree. So each scout, upon arrival, was issued a meal ticket. This was cut from a long silk ribbon that had imprinted on it the Danish flag, and the registrar had one of those old school, old style stamps where you could change the number one at a time. And so each badge got a rubber stamp, unique, 1 through 5,000, to serve as a meal ticket. But some scouts just tossed them away after the Jamboree was over because, after all, it was just a meal ticket. But some scouts saved them because they were special to them, and that later became known as the first official badge of the World Scout Jamboree. Those are very rare for several reasons. One, because a lot of them were thrown away, but secondly, because if you tried to sew it on your uniform, the type silk that it was, first wash, it disintegrated. So only those have survived that were not sewn onto uniforms but were kept in the Scouts' personal souvenirs and their collection from their participation.
Not every Jamboree has a patch as that badge. Some of them have pins and other things. Why the differences?
A lot of variety. Again, it's up to the host country, the host scouting organization, to decide what type of badge they want. And so during the course of the World Scout Jamboree, some of these host countries have decided to produce something very unique to represent some part of their history, some part of their culture, and so we do see some variety there. For instance, the badge of 1951 that was in Austria is leather. And so it was a stamped leather embossed. It has a little red and white string to hang it on the button because leather is pretty tough to sew on a shirt, although some did. but that one was leather, and it hung off the pocket. In Greece in 1963, they took the opportunity to produce some pins, not patches at all. And there was a bronze pin for participants, and then there was a silver pin for those who served on staff, and there was even a gold pin for the top leadership of that jamboree. So those were pins. And then all types of materials. We've had woven patches, we've had the standard embroidered patches, we've had silk screen patches, just about every variety of patch that you can mention. We've had it at one type or another produced for a World Scout Jamboree.
Now you mentioned that the ones from Greece, those almost look like a Spartan shield.
And that is it. It is the Greek warrior shield to represent that part of their culture and their history.
The Jamboree's been held around the world. How many countries have hosted it more than once, and who's hosted it the most?
Only a few. Well, as you would expect, since it all started in England, England holds the record with 4 World Scout Jamborees being held, and that's the first one in 1920, then the third one in 1929, then the 1957 one that commemorated the 100th anniversary of Baden-Powell's birth and the 50th anniversary of the Brown Sea Island experiment that ultimately resulted in scouting movement starting. And then in 2007, again, not surprisingly, to celebrate the centennial of scouting and the Brown Sea Island experience. So 4 in the United Kingdom. No country has hosted 3 yet. Who knows? But others have hosted 2. The first one to host 2 would be the Netherlands. They had 1937, then they had it again in 1995. So Holland has had 2. Canada has had 2, 1955 and then again in 1983. 2 different locations, but did serve as the host in both of those. And then Japan has hosted 2. Most recently in 2015, but before that in 1971. And there's still a lot of active scouters in the Boy Scouts of America who attended that jamboree in Japan in 1971 and still remember staying around to help clean up after the massive storm that struck the island of Japan there. So that was a very unique and interesting one. And then the United States, in conjunction with Canada and Mexico, of course, in 2019, but we did host one on our own in 1967 in Idaho, Farragut State Park.
Going back to these books, and actually a lot of this material, there's not necessarily one for everybody, but you mentioned staff, but there's also a case where you've got materials that have been issued both for youth participants as well as adult participants.
That's
Is that correct?
In mostly recent years, that's been the case. Earlier, a lot of the materials were pamphlets or just individual printed materials that were given to staff and unit leaders. But more recently, there have been handbooks, both for the participants, the scouts themselves, and for staff and for unit leaders, because each one needs different information about what's going to happen during the course of the jamboree.
Now, in looking at this, it's noticeably different in that there's no handbook for the jamboree that was held in 2019 at the summit. What's the story behind that? Well,
the story behind that is that one of the keys of the summit and and what we want to accomplish there is in the course of environmental awareness and sustainability. And so the leaders of our 2019 World Scout Jamboree decided not to publish a paper handbook, but to put it all in an app that was available for the scout to have on their smart device. And that was a very efficient way to do it. It also allowed it to be in real time, material added, changes made, new material opportunities added. So for 2019, we had an app as opposed to a paper handbook.
And what about the Jamboree next year? Is that also going to be electronic?
I don't know, because we're not organizing that one, so we'll have to wait and see.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us again as we continue to learn more about the history of the Boy Scouts of America through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.